Without his testimony, without DNA linking any of the three young men to the murder of Fawn Cox, the case went cold. For the Cox family, this was its own particular species of torture. They knew those teenagers had been inside their home that night. The confession had established that as a fact. One of them was eventually convicted of theft and served 8 months in custody for stealing Fawn's belongings. They knew those boys had been there. But the distance between knowing something and being able to prove it to the standard required by a court of law is sometimes enormous, and in this case it was everything. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. Months became years. And somewhere in Kansas City, the man who had murdered Fawn Marie Cox was living his life. Walking around. Going about his days. Showing up to family functions. Carrying what he had done as easily as he carried anything else. The Cox family made a decision early on, and they never wavered from it across the years and the decades that followed. They were not going to allow Fawn to become a cold case statistic. They were not going to allow her name to fade into the filing cabinets of an unsolved case file while the city moved on and forgot. They were going to fight for her for as long as it took, and they were going to be as loud as they needed to be for as long as they needed to be. Throughout the 1990s and into the 2000s, John and Beverly Cox became something that grief alone does not always produce. They became warriors. Tireless, relentless, public warriors fighting for their eldest daughter. They held fundraisers. They paid for billboards to be erected across Kansas City bearing Fawn's face and the details of her case. They offered reward money to anyone who came forward with information. $3,000 in the year 2000. $10,000 in 2019. Beverly gave interview after interview across those years, her voice carrying the particular quality of a person who has been broken and has chosen to keep speaking anyway, steady on the surface even when it trembled underneath. She would tell journalists and television reporters that money does a lot on the streets. That's what we're hoping and praying for. Amber, who had grown into adulthood carrying the specific weight of someone who understands that she could have been the one sleeping in that room on that particular night, became the family's relentless investigator in the digital age. She found every true crime forum, every cold case discussion board, every online space where Fawn's name appeared, and she engaged with all of it. She reached out to people who were talking about the case. She thanked them for keeping the story alive. She asked them directly whether they had any real information to share. In 2018, she went further, posting a detailed account of the case on a verified cold case forum that included information the police had never made public, information she hoped would trigger recognition in someone, somewhere, who knew something they had been holding on to. In that post she mentioned something that had haunted her for years. On any normal night she would have been sleeping in the room where the intruders entered. She had been across the street babysitting that night entirely by chance. The people who broke into that house had either gotten extraordinarily lucky in finding her room empty, or they had been watching the family long enough to know that on that particular night Amber would not be home. Despite everything the family did across all those years, the case stayed frozen. The reason came down to something that the Cox family found both completely understandable and absolutely devastating. Money. Resources. The gap between what forensic science could theoretically do and what the criminal justice system could practically afford to fund. In 1989, meaningful DNA analysis barely existed. By the early 2000s, when the National CODIS database came fully online, Fawn's DNA samples had been uploaded and run against the profiles of hundreds of thousands of convicted criminals. No matches came back. The person whose biological material had been found on Fawn's bedsheet had never been arrested, never been entered into any law enforcement database, never intersected with the criminal justice system in any way that would have created a record. He simply was not there. The Cox family watched from the sidelines as cold cases from the 1970s and 80s were cracked open and solved using a powerful new technique called genetic genealogy. They watched the investigation that identified the Golden State Killer after decades of anonymity, a case that had been considered unsolvable, broken open by this new approach. They watched case after case get resolved the same way. And every time it happened they asked the same question. Why not Fawn? The honest answer was not a lack of physical evidence. The evidence from Fawn's bedroom had been carefully preserved for decades. The honest answer was funding. Genetic genealogy testing is extraordinarily expensive. The number of laboratories in the world equipped to perform it properly is very small. The waiting lists at those laboratories stretch for years. Police departments operating with limited budgets have to make painful choices about which cases receive priority, and there is never enough money for everything that deserves attention. For years the Kansas City Police Department told the Cox family the same thing each time they asked. We are working on it. We just need the funding to come through. In 2019, the family stopped waiting for someone else to find the money. They launched their own fundraising campaign specifically to pay for the genetic genealogy testing themselves. Within weeks they had raised $10,000 along with the additional funds required to cover the full cost of the genealogical analysis the testing required. They walked into the Kansas City Police Department with that money in hand, ready to hand it over on the spot, ready to write whatever checks were needed, ready to do whatever it took to get the answer that had been just out of reach for 30 years. The police said no. Detective Benjamin Caldwell sat with the family and explained the position as clearly and as honestly as he could. If the department accepted private money from one family to fund testing on their specific case, it would create a system in which wealthy families could pay to have their cases moved to the front of the line while families without financial resources waited indefinitely in the back. It would be a two-tiered justice system built on the ability to pay. The policy against accepting that kind of private funding existed for genuinely good reasons, reasons rooted in fairness and equity and the principle that every victim deserves equal treatment regardless of their family's bank account. The Cox family understood every word of that explanation. They understood the logic completely. They respected what Detective Caldwell was telling them. Understanding it did not ease the pain of walking back out of that building with their money still in their hands. Felisa said what all of them were thinking, said it plainly and without softening it. If this had been a rich family, she said, or someone important, this case would have been solved a long time ago. She was right. Everyone in that room knew she was right. And there was nothing anyone could say to make that truth less true. But in the summer of 2020, everything changed. In June of 2020, the federal government launched an initiative called Operation Legend, a sweeping federal program designed to deploy additional resources to American cities experiencing sharp increases in violent crime. The operation was named after a 4-year-old boy named Legend Talifer, who had been shot and killed while sleeping in his own home in Kansas City, Missouri. His name was given to a program built to honor the principle that no victim, no matter how young, no matter how many years had passed, should be left without justice. The operation brought with it something the Cox family had been praying and fighting for across 3 decades. Federal funding. Federal Bureau of Investigation Resources. Access to advanced forensic laboratories operating at the cutting edge of what science could do. And most critically, access to the genetic genealogy testing that had been out of reach for so many years. Captain Benjamin Caldwell, who had recently been promoted within the department and who had never stopped caring about Fawn's case, recognized the opportunity the moment it arrived. He submitted Fawn's case for consideration under the new federal testing protocol immediately. It was approved. The biological material that had been collected from Fawn's bedroom in 1989, preserved in storage across 3 decades, was sent to Parabon Nanolabs, one of the most respected and sophisticated genetic genealogy firms in the world. What Parabon does with a DNA sample is something that would have seemed like pure science fiction to the investigators who first worked Fawn's case in the summer of 1989. Rather than simply comparing the sample to a database of known criminal profiles and hoping for a direct hit, genetic genealogy works by comparing the sample against the DNA profiles that millions of ordinary people have voluntarily submitted to commercial ancestry services like Ancestry DNA and 23andMe. From those comparisons, scientists can identify distant relatives of the unknown individual. Second cousins. Third cousins. Relatives separated by generations. Using those distant connections as starting points, genealogists then build family trees working backward and forward through generations, methodically narrowing the field of possible candidates until they can identify a specific individual or small group of individuals who can then be investigated by law enforcement through traditional means. It is extraordinarily painstaking work. It requires both advanced scientific capability and serious genealogical research skills. It takes time and patience and precision. But it works. The Golden State Killer proved that it works. Dozens of cold cases solved in the years since have proven it again and again. For weeks after the samples were submitted to Parabon, the Cox family lived in a state of suspended breath. 31 years of fighting had brought them to this moment. 31 years of billboards and fundraisers and interviews and sleepless nights and rewards offered and tips chased down and forum posts and prayers that never stopped. After all of that, the answer was somewhere in a laboratory, being assembled from strands of biological material that Fawn herself had left behind on the night she was murdered. A silent message she had never known she was sending. Waiting 31 years for the science to exist that could finally read it. On November 11, 2020, 31 years and 4 months after the night Fawn Marie Cox was murdered in her own bedroom, the Kansas City Police Department called the Cox family with news. They had found him. The name that came through that phone call detonated inside the Cox family like something physical. Donald Lee Cox Jr. Not a stranger. Not a faceless predator who had drifted through the neighborhood one summer night and disappeared back into anonymity. Not one of the 9th Street dogs. Not anyone the family had ever focused their suspicion on. Not anyone who fit the profile of an outsider. Donald Lee Cox Jr. was Fawn's cousin. He had been 21 years old when he murdered her. 5 years older. Close enough in age that they had grown up in proximity to each other, present at the same family events, known to each other in the ordinary ways that cousins are known to each other. He had been inside the Cox family home on numerous occasions. He had eaten Beverly Cox's cooking at that table. He had walked through those rooms. He knew every detail of how that household functioned. He knew which windows were left unlocked in the summer and why. He knew the family's rhythms and routines. He knew that on the night of July 25, 1989, Fawn would be coming home from a late shift, that she would be tired, that she would go to bed on the second floor while the rest of the family settled into the cooler air downstairs around the loud old air conditioning unit that made it impossible to hear anything happening one floor above. He used every single piece of that knowledge. He used the trust the family had placed in him. He used the familiarity he had been given as a guest in their home. He used all of it to climb through the window in the dark and rape and strangle his 16-year-old cousin in her own bed. And then he came back. To the funeral. To the family dinners. To the holidays. He sat at the table where Beverly Cox had once fed him, and he looked John and Beverly in the eyes across 31 years of Thanksgiving and Christmas and ordinary Sunday visits. He watched Fawn's parents age under the weight of a grief that he had personally created. He watched her sisters grow into women who had learned to carry absence as a permanent companion. He stood beside this family and performed mourning for 3 decades, and he never said a single word. According to Amber, there had always been something about Donald that unsettled her without her being able to fully explain it. Something she could feel but not name. She would later reveal that Donald had, over the years, sexually abused younger girls within the extended family. These were secrets that had been buried in the complicated silence that families sometimes build around their most damaging members, out of shame, out of not knowing what to do, out of the particular paralysis that comes from realizing the person who has caused harm is someone you are connected to by blood. But murder. That was something nobody had allowed themselves to imagine. That was a line no one had drawn around Donald in their minds. The family would never get to face him in a courtroom. Donald Lee Cox Jr. had died in 2006. 14 years before science found him. He had overdosed on drugs. His death had been investigated due to suspicious circumstances surrounding how it occurred, and as part of that investigation a blood sample had been collected and preserved during his autopsy. Standard procedure for a death under investigation. But because Donald was classified as the subject of that investigation rather than as a criminal suspect, his DNA profile was never entered into any law enforcement database. It went into storage. Into a container in a facility somewhere. Where it sat for 14 years, waiting without knowing it was waiting, until 2020 when Parabon Nanolabs built a genetic family tree from the biological material found on Fawn's bedsheet, and that tree led directly and unmistakably to Donald Lee Cox Jr. Detectives contacted the facility holding his stored sample and requested it for comparison. The sample was tested against the material recovered from Fawn's bedroom 31 years earlier. 100% match. 31 years. And the man who murdered Fawn Marie Cox had been sitting at the family table the entire time. Even with Donald identified and the case officially closed, the Cox family has been left with questions that may never be answered, questions that have become part of the permanent weight they carry. The three teenagers. The ones who broke into the house. The ones whose stolen items were sitting in the grass of the yard the morning after. The Nintendo. The stereo. The radios. Where do they fit in the complete picture of what happened that night? Did Donald coordinate with them? Was he part of the same break-in, someone who came along and then separated from the group and went somewhere in the house the others did not go? Or did he arrive separately from the teenagers entirely, slipping into the house on his own, hiding somewhere upstairs in the dark while the three boys moved through the lower floor filling their arms with electronics? Did those boys know he was there? Did they hear anything from upstairs that night that they have never told anyone about? Or did they throw those items out the window, collect what they could, and run before they ever knew what was happening in the room above them? Police closed the case without filing additional charges against anyone else. According to Felisa, the reasoning was straightforward and honest even if it was difficult to accept. Even if the three teenagers had been physically present in the Cox house that night, and the partial confession had made it clear that at least one of them had been, there was no physical evidence connecting any of them to the murder or the assault. Only Donald's DNA had been found on Fawn. Without evidence of participation in the crime itself, there was no prosecutable case to bring. Perhaps the teenagers genuinely had no idea what was happening upstairs. Perhaps they grabbed what they came to steal and ran, and Donald stayed behind in the darkness, and what happened next was something they only learned about when the rest of the neighborhood did. Perhaps we will simply never know. The second unanswered question is darker than the first. In 1984, 5 years before Fawn's murder, a 20-year-old woman named Tracy Snow disappeared from the same neighborhood. She was Fawn's neighbor. She lived close enough to the Cox home that her disappearance would have been known to the entire extended family. She was never found. Donald Cox would have been 16 years old at the time she vanished. Old enough. Close enough to the area. Already, it appears, beginning to develop a pattern of predatory behavior toward the women and girls around him, behavior that had been quietly buried in family shame rather than brought to light. Could Donald have been responsible for Tracy Snow's disappearance? How many other families are there? How many other names are attached to cases that have never been connected to a man who died in 2006 before anyone knew to connect them? How many other daughters never came home and the people who loved them are still waiting for a phone call that science has not yet been able to make? Donald Lee Cox Jr. lived 17 years after the night he murdered Fawn. He was arrested repeatedly during those 17 years for theft and for drug offenses. He left damage and chaos in his wake everywhere he moved. He burned through every relationship. He caused pain without cease. And then in 2006 his addiction finally caught up with him and killed him, and some people who heard the news later said that was karma, and some people said that was an escape, because dying of an overdose is considerably easier than sitting in a courtroom looking at the faces of the family you destroyed. Fawn Marie Cox was 16 years old when she died. She was saving her tips to buy her first car. She spent weekend afternoons roller skating with the sisters she helped raise. She never missed church on Sunday mornings. She had a best friend who lived across the street in long summer evenings full of easy conversation and the particular likeness of being 16 and not yet knowing that the world contains anything you need to protect yourself from. She had dreams. She had plans. She had a senior year waiting. She had a whole life stretching out ahead of her that she was just beginning to understand the shape and possibility of. All of it was taken from her on July 26, 1989, by someone she trusted, someone her family trusted, someone who was supposed to be part of the circle of people who kept her safe. Her family spent 31 years refusing to allow her to be reduced to an entry in an unsolved case file. They'd put her face on billboards across Kansas City so that anyone who drove through that city had to look at her and remember that she had existed and that someone had taken her and that the person responsible had never been identified. They offered reward money year after year, raising the amount as the years passed and the urgency mounted. They gave interviews when they were exhausted and heartbroken and had nothing left to give, because Beverly Cox had decided early on that she was going to keep talking about her daughter for as long as she had breath to do it. Amber spent years of her adult life on cold case forums and websites, reaching out to strangers, asking for help, posting information the police had never released because she believed that somewhere out there someone knew something and just needed to be asked the right way. They fought. All of them. Without stopping. Without surrendering. Without ever once accepting that Fawn's story was over. And eventually, across 31 years and a revolution in forensic science and a federal initiative named after a murdered 4-year-old boy, the truth came. But truth is not always clean and it is not always satisfying and it does not always give you what you imagined it would when you spent decades chasing it. The truth, when it arrived, came with pain attached that the Cox family had not anticipated. Because the man who murdered Fawn was not a stranger who could be placed neatly outside the boundaries of their love and their trust. He was inside those boundaries. He had always been inside them. He was family, in the most literal sense of that word, and there is a particular kind of devastation that comes from learning that the monster you had been hunting for 3 decades had been sitting at your table the entire time. Captain Benjamin Caldwell, who had fought for years to get Fawn's case the resources it needed and who had submitted it for testing the moment the opportunity arose, put it as simply and as honestly as it could be put. He said this one touched a lot of people because she was an innocent child who was murdered in her own bed. Fawn's case carries lessons inside it that reach beyond the details of one family's tragedy. It shows us how far forensic science has traveled in the decades since 1989, and it shows us with equal clarity how fragile and contingent justice can be when it depends on funding and resources and timing and the availability of technology that may not yet exist. Without genetic genealogy, Donald Lee Cox Jr. would have died in 2006 as nothing more than a man who struggled with addiction and caused problems for the people around him. Anonymous. Unidentified. And the Cox family would have carried their unanswered question to their own graves. There are 3 things that Fawn's story asks us to hold on to. The first is that evil does not announce itself. It does not come from the direction we are watching. It does not wear a face we do not recognize or carry itself in a way that sets off alarm bells. Sometimes it sits across the table from you at Christmas dinner, passing the food and looking directly into your eyes. Sometimes it is the person you have known the longest, trusted the most, let the furthest inside. The most dangerous threat is not always the stranger. Sometimes it is already home. The second is that justice delayed is not the same thing as justice denied. 31 years is an almost incomprehensible amount of time for a family to wait. It is long enough for the world to change beyond recognition, for science to advance past what anyone thought possible, for the killer himself to die before he can be confronted. And still the answer came. The evidence Fawn left behind in 1989 was patient in a way that human beings cannot always afford to be. It waited for the science that could read it. And when that science arrived, it spoke. The third is that families like the Coxes, families who refuse to stop making noise, who keep the name alive year after year after year, are not just grieving parents and siblings. They are the reason the system keeps trying. They are the pressure that keeps cold cases from being permanently filed away and forgotten. Without Beverly and John and Amber and Felisa, Fawn's case would have been easier to deprioritize. Their relentlessness made it harder to ignore. Their refusal to accept silence was a form of advocacy that ultimately contributed to the resolution of the case. They are, in the most complete and honest sense of the phrase, the true heroes of this story. Fawn Marie Cox should be 51 years old today. She should have graduated from Northeast High School. She should have bought that car with the money she was saving, should have pulled into the school parking lot in it on the first day of senior year feeling exactly the way she had imagined she would feel. She should have gone on to whatever came next. College or a career or something she invented entirely on her own terms. She should have fallen in love. She should have had the chance to build a life that reflected who she was, responsible and warm and present and steady. She should have grown old alongside her sisters. She should have been there to take care of John and Beverly the way she had always taken care of the people she loved. Instead, she is frozen at 16. A girl with sore feet from a long shift and a jar of savings in her bedroom and a dream about a car, stopped completely and permanently on the night of July 25, 1989. But she is not forgotten. She has never been forgotten. Her family made sure of that across 31 years of fighting. In 1989, Fawn left behind something that no one at the time knew how to read. Biological evidence preserved in the fibers of her bed sheet. A message written in the language of DNA, waiting in storage through 3 decades of advancing science for the moment when someone would finally have the tools to hear what it was saying. In 2020, Parabon Nanolabs gave that evidence a voice. And the voice said a name. The orange dumpster truck that John Cox parked in the alleyway beneath the girl's window all those years ago appears in old photographs of the house, bright and orange and completely ordinary, sitting where it always sat. The window above it is there too, the way it always was, unlocked and open to the summer air. For 31 years those images carried the weight of what had been used and what had been betrayed. A family's ordinary life turned into instruments of their own destruction. But they mean something different now. The truck is no longer just the ladder that a killer used to reach an unlocked window. It is part of a chain of evidence that eventually led to the truth, a piece of an ordinary summer night that turned out to matter in ways nobody understood at the time. The unlocked window is no longer just the vulnerability that was exploited. It is a reminder that the thing which made that house unsafe was not a policy about windows or a parking spot in an alleyway. It was a person. A person who had been trusted and welcomed and fed at the family table. The danger did not come from outside. The danger had already been inside for years. If you have stayed with this story all the way to this moment, then you are the kind of person this channel exists for. These cases are not easy to sit with. They require something from you. They ask you to witness something painful and to care about people you have never met and to hold the weight of a family's 31 years of grief for the length of a video. That is not nothing. It matters. Fawn Marie Cox was a daughter and a sister and a best friend and a girl with sore feet and a dream about a car. She deserved so much more than what she got. She deserved her senior year and her car and her future and the chance to find out who she was going to become. She deserved to grow old. She deserved to be safe in her own home. Her family gave everything they had for 31 years to make sure she was not forgotten. And science, eventually, gave them the answer they had been fighting toward. That is not a happy ending. There is no happy ending here. But it is the truth. And the truth, however long it takes to arrive, is what these families are owed. If this story moved you, please like this video right now and share it with someone who believes that victims deserve to be remembered and families deserve to be heard. Subscribe to this channel so you are here for the next story, and the one after that, because there are more names that need to be spoken and more families that need a witness. Drop a comment below with your thoughts on Fawn's case. Every comment, every share, every new person who finds this channel is another small act of keeping these stories alive. Remember Fawn Marie Cox. A daughter. A sister. A friend. 16 years old and saving her tips to buy a car. She deserved so much better. But because her family never stopped fighting, her story finally has an ending.